Hi, I'm Cathy Olds, and I'm the coordinator of spiritual direction at the Franciscan Renewal Center in Scottsdale, and I also am a spiritual director at St. Bridget's in Mesa. And we've had a number of questions from folks about the origins of spiritual direction, whether it's Catholic or not. So we thought we'd do this video to explain a bit about where spiritual direction comes from, how it has been a part of our spiritual tradition for centuries. And we start clear at the beginning. Of course, Jesus is our first and most important spiritual director. And he, according to the Gospels, was one who not only cared about the crowds that followed him, but was also concerned about the individuals. So spiritual direction is about bringing the individual closer to God, listening for how God's Spirit is working in that person's life. And Jesus was such a master at that. So as his followers, we hope to help one another live our Christian life in the day-to-day world. So Jesus is our first spiritual director, and he would have been a rabbi, a teacher, and that was one of the roles of rabbis in his time, was to act as spiritual directors for their community or their village. We also in the New Testament see that St. Paul writes to individuals as well as some of the Christian communities that he founded, and gives spiritual advice to individuals. And his work was about teaching Christianity and how we are to live Christianity in the day-to-day, which again is very much what spiritual direction does. We believe that the Christian church, or we know that the Christian church in that first century and even into the second century was very much a community that was defined by the words of Jesus and the death and resurrection of Jesus as communicated by his disciples and apostles. But we also know that the Christian community lived in a very pagan culture, a very hostile culture. Christianity was seen as very countercultural. So part of the work of Christians living in the world was to share the gospel with others, which could be a dangerous thing, of course, and what they came to call the victory of martyrdom. So martyrdom was a real possibility throughout the first and second and into the third century. So part of what we understand about spiritual direction is that this is a community that needs support and needs individuals that can help teach and mentor and help the community understand what God is calling them to. So in the early Christian communities, as today, the spiritual director is always the Spirit of God. So our role as spiritual directors is to listen for that Spirit of God in a person's life, in the things that happen to them, in their relationships. And that would have been the same for people of the first century in those Christian communities. This was a lay church. This was not a church run by clergy. The clergy had a role of supporting the community, of helping feed the community and care for the needs of the community and lead worship for the community. But they were not really about telling people how to live their day-to-day life. They were holy people, but the holiness was not just the job of the clergy. Again, this is a very small group of people that are there to serve. So the ordinary lay person, and this was very much a lay church at that time, the ordinary lay person was to discern how they personally were to live out this Christian call, how they were individually supposed to follow Jesus. So part of what we do as spiritual directors is to, again, listen to what's going on in a person's life and to help them name what God is calling them to. And the people of the first and second century would have needed that very much, especially in situations where there was persecution. And even if there wasn't persecution, Roman culture was a very hierarchical, had a very strong class system, and pagan beliefs were structured into the everyday life of its people. So how you celebrated different events, what you ate, all those kinds of things had connections to the pagan culture. Of course, the governmental and the monetary system was all connected to that pagan culture as well. And even after the fall of the Roman Empire, there were pagan cultures that came in and conquered the structures of the Roman government. So even after Rome falls, you're still dealing as Christians with a pagan culture. So as we move through that first and second century, the focus is lay people really discerning what the moral life should be, and forming individual conscience, how they personally must live out their Christian commitment in this hostile culture. Beginning in the second century, you have the beginnings of the disintegration of the Roman Empire. And of course, as that moves into the third and fourth century, that increases. And what's happening is you have, the disintegration of civil institutions, and you have things like education being lost for the majority of people of the time. So as government becomes more corrupt, as government fails to serve the people, there's nothing to replace it. So Christianity then is dealing with that situation, the lack of education, etc. In 312, the Roman Empire is led by a new emperor, Constantine, and excuse me. There is an openness to religion, of all religions, and eventually Constantine declares Christianity as the religion of the empire. And that is revolutionary for Christians, because, first of all, the clergy are given legal status. In the Roman Empire, the leaders of the temple, the clergy, the priests of the temple, were given special legal status and privileges. So when Christianity becomes the religion of the empire, clergy are given that legal status and those privileges. So at that point, the role of the laity, and particularly the role of women, begins to decline. So lay spirituality is also struggling with the number of baptisms. So as Christianity becomes the religion of the empire, you have mass baptisms. You have entire regiments of the military that are baptized. You have just whole groups, not just families and members and their slaves who are baptized, but large groups of people. And so there isn't this commitment, this intense commitment to living the Christian life. So, and again, there's not a whole lot of clergy. There's a lack of education. So you have a real difficulty in particularly the laity understanding what the Christian commitment is. And there are people in this situation that long for the church of the first and second century, long for the church that is connected to the apostles and connected to the intensity of that early experience of Christian community. You have wealthy women in particular who leave their homes, leave their husbands, take their wealth, and move into small communities of women that wanted to live a very ascetic life. You have the same thing happening among individual men. So you've got a monastery that's set up outside Jerusalem by a group of women who were followers or disciples of Saint Jerome. You have a group of men who set up hermitages outside of Jerusalem or in the desert of Israel and in Syria. And these people who are seeking this more intense and committed Christian life, call this a white martyrdom. So blood martyrdom is no longer something that happens in the church after Constantine. So how do we show that intense commitment to being a follower of Jesus? Well, it's in this ascetic move to the desert. So in the third century, about the middle of the 3rd century, you have these individuals moving into the desert. And one of the first is St. Anthony. He's called St. Anthony of Egypt or St. Anthony of the Desert. But he certainly wasn't the only one. And he, among others, would move into the desert and live alone, live as hermits. The word monasticism comes from this early Christian practice. It comes from the Greek word monakos, which means single one. So that was the name given to these desert dwellers who were really about living an intentional Christian life and an intentional asceticism. So they're living in the desert outside of Alexandria, Egypt. They work at prayer and meditation, repentance, purification, and make a commitment to celibacy, which was still very controversial for those folks. Celibacy was something that was actually outlawed by some Roman emperors, because you had these wealthy women, leaving their husbands, and you had widows and virgins who were leaving to join these communities of Christians, women seeking this ascetic life. So you've got these desert fathers and mothers who then are in the desert. Some of them come together for prayer, but more often than not, they worked alone. But a lot of these, or they prayed alone. A lot of these people really wanted this deep relationship with God. And living in the desert, of course, was a dangerous thing. So they needed someone who had been there and done that to help them know how to live in the desert. You can imagine, especially here in Arizona, what that might have been like. But you also have a need for spiritual guides in living this intense asceticism. So you've got an individual, living in their own mud hut, and they're, praying day and night, and they're fasting, and all kinds of questions come up. So it's like the voice that I'm hearing, is that my own voice or is that God's voice? I find that it's hard to pray, and I have all of these, thoughts, some of these negative thoughts. What do I do with my negative thoughts? And, so you had these desert fathers and mothers who became directors, who became mentors to these folks coming into the desert to live this life. They would give, some advice, but they would often really help that person focus on the presence of God within, listening for the Spirit of God, discerning. Discernment was a really important part of the work of these spiritual directors or mentors. They would oftentimes talk about this life as being we're about the way of the heart. And that's part of, that's one of the titles of a book about the spiritual desert fathers and mothers by Henry Nouwen called The Way of the Heart. So these early spiritual directors were still very much a part of the community. They separated themselves from the world, but would oftentimes go back into the world, go back to the Christian communities to serve the poor there. So that was also a part of the need for discernment. So if you can imagine focusing on prayer all the time, you could be really tempted to just stay there. It's me and God, and we have this great connection. We have this great relationship, and it can become very self-centered. But true prayer should lead us to the care for others, and that was built into how these desert fathers and mothers would teach their spirituality. As you get more and more of these desert fathers and mothers living in the desert, and you have people coming to them for advice, wanting to join them in this effort to live this Christian ascetic life, to cultivate the honesty and the self-awareness, the humility and the forgiveness that the Christian life was calling for. You have certain individuals that start gathering people around them. So you have communities of people that will pray together and seek this life together. By 340 AD, you have Pachomius, who writes the first rule for one of these groups, and it's understood as one of the first rules for a religious community. Of course, after this, you have St. Augustine in the 4th century, as well as St. Benedict in the 5th century, who develops a rule. And of course, many of the religious orders of today use and follow that Benedictine rule for religious life. So this is actually the beginning of monasticism, is among these desert fathers and mothers. But remember that these desert fathers and mothers and the vast majority of the people that came to join them were lay people. Even today, religious orders, sisters and brothers, are lay. They are not clergy. Again, the role of the clergy was to lead and to care for the community. And it was the role of the lay people to really discern how to live the Christian life. So as monasticism grows, this focus on spirituality and living the spiritual life becomes really focused on the monasteries. And we'll take up some of this in the next video when we talk about the Celtic Christian influence on spiritual direction and how that is carried into Europe and develops and how it leads us to where we are today. So the big idea is that Christianity was first of all lay communities led by a small group of clergy, but the spirituality was focused on the lay folks living in the world, and working to live that Christian life, the life that God called them in Christ. So spiritual direction then was a way to help mentor people in living that life, especially after Constantine and Christianity becomes the religion of the empire and built into the governing structures and institutions as well. So I hope that's been helpful in understanding the origins and the very beginnings of spiritual direction, and we'll take up where it goes from there in the next video. Thanks for listening. Bye.